There is a moment in the life of the lonely person that does not seem great in the eyes of the world, but that changes everything inside. It is not an external event. It is not a visible achievement. It's not something that can be photographed or advertised. It is a silent displacement of the soul. That's when the empath, after going through years of invisible pain, begins to realize that his loneliness was never a punishment, but a calling. For a long time he believed that he was just different from the others, too sensitive, too deep, too intense. As the world ran, he felt it. While the world competed, it absorbed. While the world screamed, he was silent, and in that silence something began to form. It was not weakness, it was preparation. The true loner is not born isolated by incapacity. He is driven away by fate itself. There is a kind of invisible selection that leads him into himself. People come and go. Cycles begin and end. Expectations crumble. And little by little the old identity loses meaning. What once seemed important no longer touches. That which once hurt no longer has the same power. There is fatigue, but it is not exhaustion. It is the fatigue of those who are leaving an old skin behind. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as a rare, almost solitary path. Few cross to the end because few can bear to face their own shadow without fleeing. The empath, however, spends years being forced to look at what he feels. He cannot turn off his own sensitivity. He can't pretend he doesn't notice. And it is exactly this intensity that leads him to Sophia. Sophia is not a title. It is not a spiritual label. It is an internal state where fragmentation ends. This is when the lonely person stops trying to be accepted and finally begins to accept himself. This is when pain ceases to be an open wound and turns into deep understanding. This is when isolation ceases to be abandonment and becomes a conscious choice. But there is a specific point in this journey, a point of no return, an almost imperceptible instant in which the empath realizes that he can no longer go back to who he was. The old identity begins to die silently. There is no external drama. There is no announcement. There is only one quiet certainty. Something has ended. For years, the loner believed he needed to adapt, that he needed to dim his own light, that she needed to explain too much what she felt, that he needed to fit in to survive. And without realizing it, he learned something else. He learned to observe himself, to be heard, to distinguish what was his and what was the projection of others. He learned that his sensitivity was not a curse, but a tool for transformation. When Sophia begins to emerge, the empath doesn't become louder anymore. He becomes more serene. He does not seek recognition. He seeks truth. He doesn't want to prove anything. He wants internal coherence. There is a change in the look, a change in posture, a change in the way of occupying one's own space. The most curious thing is that externally, almost nothing seems to happen. The routine continues, people continue, the world goes on, but inside, the old structure dissolves. The need for approval weakens. The fear of being alone disappears. The anxiety about belonging loses strength. A different presence emerges, a presence that no longer begs for love because it begins to love itself silently. When the lonely catches up with Sophia, something irreversible happens. He ceases to fight against nature itself. He stops blaming himself for feeling deeply. He no longer sees himself as inadequate. And at that moment, a new identity begins to be born. It is not an identity built to impress. It is an identity aligned with one's own essence. It is the end of a life based on emotional survival. It is the beginning of a consciousness-based existence. Few get here, because getting here requires going through the darkness itself. It requires accepting one's own shadow. It requires giving up the old version that depended on the external gaze to feel alive. Most prefer to remain comfortable on repetition, But the lonely who insists on getting to know himself crosses this threshold, and when it crosses, there is no turning back. He doesn't go back to begging for empty connections. He does not diminish his perception to fit into superficial environments. He does not abandon himself again to maintain fragile bonds. Something inside him reorganizes itself definitively. What was once pain turns into wisdom. What was once loneliness turns into autonomy. What was once confusion turns into quiet clarity. This is the moment when transformation ceases to be a promise and becomes an internal reality. This is the instant when the loner realizes that his journey has never been about fitting into the world, but about integrating his own soul. And when this integration happens, life no longer needs applause. It just needs real. The silent pain that separated you from the world. Before any ascent, there was a withdrawal. Before any liberation, there was a pain that no one saw. The loner did not start strong. He started out confused, feeling too much, overthinking, noticing details that others ignored. While many moved lightly through relationships, he carried every word, every gesture, every absence. There was a time when he believed he needed to change in order to be accepted, that it needed to be less intense, less profound, less true. He tried. He tried to smile when he wanted silence. He tried to agree when he felt disagreement. He tried to fit into conversations that didn't touch his soul. But each attempt left a sense of internal fragmentation. This fragmentation was the beginning of the silent pain. It wasn't a dramatic pain. It was not something that could be easily explained. It was a constant feeling of not belonging, to be physically present but spiritually absent, to be seen but not understood. The empath absorbed the environment, absorbed emotions, absorbed tensions that were not even his own, and in doing so, he began to lose touch with his own essence. Loneliness arose at this point. Not as a conscious choice, but as a natural consequence. He began to walk away, not out of contempt, not because of superiority, but because staying in certain spaces required him to betray himself. And little by little, the soul got tired of betraying itself. Carl Jung said that no one becomes whole by remaining only in the light. It is necessary to cross the shadow. And the shadow of the empath was precisely this pain of inadequacy. This feeling that the world was too shallow for its depth. This perception that something inside him was being stifled. But the pain did not come to destroy. She came to separate what was essence from what was adaptation, to separate what was true from what was a mask, to separate what was destiny from what was someone else's expectation. It was in this period that the old identity began to weaken. The version that sought validation began to lose strength. The version that begged for recognition began to dissolve. Not because the world has changed, but because something internal has begun to awaken. Loneliness, which once seemed like rejection, began to reveal another face. In the silence, he began to hear himself. On the way away, he began to observe himself. In isolation, he began to find himself. This is the first phase of the transformation of no return. The recognition of pain not as an enemy, but as a portal. Few go through this portal because it requires brutal honesty. It requires admitting that many connections were sustained by the fear of being alone. It requires recognizing that many choices were made to please, not to align. The loner who reaches Sophia goes through this inner purification. He senses the end of the old identity before anything new emerges. He experiences emptiness before fullness. It goes through the night before dawn. And it is exactly in this deep silence that the integration of the shadow begins. He stops fighting his sensitivity. Stop blaming yourself for its intensity. Stop wishing to be less. The pain that separated him from the world begins to unite him with himself. And this union is the beginning of something irreversible. the death of the old identity and the awakening of the inner truth. Once the pain is acknowledged and accepted, something begins to change silently. It's not an explosion. It is not a dramatic decision. It's a perception. The empath begins to understand that what he called personality was in fact a survival mechanism. For years, he believed that he needed to be too understanding, too available, too patient. He believed that his job was to maintain harmony, even if it cost him his own peace. He adapted so much that he almost disappeared within the expectations of others. But when Sophia begins to awaken, this structure does not hold. The old identity begins to feel heavy, artificial, forced. He realizes that a large part of his reactions did not come from the essence, but from the fear of losing connection, fear of being rejected, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being alone. And then something profound happens. He stops fearing loneliness. The loneliness that once seemed like a threat begins to reveal its true nature. It is not abandonment. It's space. It is fertile silence. It is inner territory where the truth can finally breathe. Carl Jung described individuation as the process in which the human being stops living fragmented and starts to integrate his hidden parts. The empath, throughout its journey, has been accumulating fragments. He carried light, but hid his own shadow. He showed understanding, but he suppressed legitimate irritations. He offered love, but denied himself the same care. When Sophia emerges, the shadow is no longer avoided. She is welcomed. He begins to recognize that he also has limits, who also feels angry, which also needs space, who can also say no without guilt. This integration doesn't make it cooler, it makes it whole. Symbolic death happens at this point. It is not the death of the heart, it is the death of the mask. It is the end of the version that needed to be constantly validated. It is the end of the identity built to please. And this death is irreversible, because once he realizes that he was living partially, he can no longer accept living halfway. Once he gets a taste of authenticity, he can no longer return to the old role. He begins to act more simply, more direct, more aligned, not because he learned techniques, not because he decided to impose himself, but because it no longer feels the need to fragment. The search for approval loses strength. The need to explain who he is begins to fade. He understands that whoever is in tune will stay. Those who are not will follow another path. This understanding brings a new peace. It is not indifference. It is serenity. It is the tranquility of knowing that you do not have to fight to exist. He begins to love his own presence, to value your moments of silence, to respect your sensitivity as a strength, not as a defect. The loner who reaches this stage does not become distant from the world. He just stops getting lost in it. There is an internal stability that no longer depends on external circumstances. He continues to feel deeply, but he no longer dissolves in the emotions of others. He continues to connect, but he does not abandon himself in the process. That is silent liberation. Few get here because it requires courage to let go of the old identity. It requires accepting that perhaps some relationships existed only because he was willing to diminish himself. It requires recognizing that the rarity of one's own soul can mean walking with less company. But when he accepts this, something inside reorganizes itself. He begins to choose himself, not as a selfish act, but as an act of truth. He understands that loving others should never have meant abandoning oneself, and when he integrates this awareness, he feels something that he had never fully felt: coherence. Coherence between what you feel and what you demonstrate, between what you want and what you allow, between what is on the inside and what she expresses on the outside. When Sophia settles in, there is no going back to the old fragmentation. He can no longer pretend that he doesn't see patterns that hurt him. It can no longer ignore internal signals. He can no longer negotiate his essence for acceptance. The old identity dissolves like a skin that has already fulfilled its function. In its place, a firmer, calmer, and truer presence is born. And it is at this moment that the empath realizes that his loneliness was never a mistake. It was the necessary path to find himself again, and this discovery changes everything. The silent ascension and the love that no longer depends on the world. Once the old identity dies and the shadow is integrated, there is no outward explosion. There is no announcement. There is no collective recognition. What emerges is something much rarer, an inner presence that does not fluctuate with the opinion of others. This is where Sophia settles in definitively. The empath realizes that he is no longer trying to prove himself. He is no longer trying to convince anyone of his worth. He is no longer trying to save, sustain, or fix everything around him. It begins to exist effortlessly. This is the silent ascent. On the outside, it remains simple. He remains reserved. It remains profound. But inside, there is a new structure, a base that does not depend on applause, validation, or belonging. For years, he confused love with need. He confused connection with attachment. He confused intensity with excessive responsibility. Now he understands that to love is not to sacrifice oneself until one disappears. To love is not to mold oneself until it loses shape. To love is not to endure what hurts just to maintain closeness. When Sophia fully awakens, he begins to love himself in a natural way, not as a speech, not as a repeated statement, but as an internal posture. He respects his limits. He honors his silence. He accepts his depth. He makes no apologies for being who he is, and something irreversible happens. He is no longer afraid of losing people. Not because he doesn't care, but because he understands that those who don't recognize his truth can't walk by his side. He does not force permanence. It does not beg continuity. It does not negotiate essence. This brings a peace that few know. The peace of not having to chase it. The peace of not having to explain excessively. The peace of not having to dim your own light to make others feel comfortable. Jung stated that true transformation occurs when the individual stops living according to collective expectations and starts to respond to his own soul. The lonely who reaches Sophia no longer lives to respond. He lives to be consistent. There is a change in the look. He observes the world with more compassion, but with less dependence. He connects with more depth, but with less attachment. He relates with more truth, but with less fear. Your loneliness ceases to be a burden and becomes a conscious choice. He enjoys his own company. He appreciates his own pace. He appreciates his own mind. And paradoxically, it is at this moment that their connections become more authentic. Because now he doesn't approach out of need. He approaches by affinity. It does not remain out of fear. It remains by alignment. This is the transformation of no return. He can no longer return to the old pattern of self-abandonment. He can no longer ignore his own intuition. He can no longer accept less than what his soul recognizes as true. The old version, which sought belonging at any cost, no longer exists. In its place, there is a centered identity, a rare identity, an identity that was born of silence, integrated pain, and the courage to cross one's own shadow. Few get here, because getting here requires giving up the need to be understood by everyone. It requires accepting that rarity brings less noise and more depth. It requires walking for a while without an audience. But when the empath goes through this phase, he realizes something fundamental. He has never been late. It was never broke. He was never wrong. He was preparing for that state where the soul no longer depends on the world to feel whole. When the lonely catches up with Sophia, something irreversible happens. He stops surviving. He begins to live.